Welcome back, and now let's get into the Republic. So the Republic has a lot of complex history in it, in the latter part of it, so I'm going to have to be relatively brief for this course, but shameless plug, I will mention that this period of history is covered in much more detail in CLA 396, Myths of Rome, so please take that course, and then that will allow you to learn a lot more about Republican history. But here, as I say, I'm going to have to be relatively brief. So the Republic is defined by the position of consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, two of them that are elected annually by representatives of the Roman populace. It was obviously quite a change from kingship, and it was one that was definitely regarded quite favorably through most of Roman history, in contradistinction to the kings that were obviously associated, due to especially to Tarquinius Superbus, with corruption and excessive solitary rule. So the Roman Republic starts off in a relatively bitter period of warfare as the Romans gradually have to establish themselves militarily within Italy. That period goes from 509 down to 272 BC. The last city that holds out the longest is down in the south, and it's Tarentum. Prior to that, the Romans had expanded north, and they'd also made alliances with all the nearby places. But by 272 BC, the Romans had Italy all under their control. In that period, the Romans had also evolved politically. Initially, under the first years of the Republic, the Romans appear to have kept the senatorial families, the patricians, in sole rule of the Republic. However, within 15 years of our canonical date of the foundation, the plebeians rebelled, and they set up their own form of government with tribunes. And these tribunes were essentially overseers of the plebs, who would be in place. There were three of them altogether. They were in place to ensure that the Roman Senate, the aristocratic body up there, would not pass legislation that would ignore their important interests. And the tribunes had a special ability to veto any legislation from the Roman Senate that they thought was contrary to the interests of the plebs. Initially, they were laughed at, but in time, as they grew politically, especially in number, the Roman aristocrats realized that they had to take really, really serious account of them and reconcile with them as much as possible. In time, in the 300s BC, different forms of legislation came along to allow, and then actually to mandate the plebs to become part of government, and even eventually to become consul. So the plebs did very slowly grow in their capacity. But one of the consequences that comes about as the plebs become more politically involved, and also as the Romans expand militarily, is that some plebs are more successful at their financial endeavors and political growth than others. So we end up essentially with a three-way split: the patricians, wealthy, successful plebs, and not wealthy, not successful plebs. So what happens in the 200s down into the 100s BC is that the Romans start expanding militarily outside. The first place they go after is Carthage, because the Carthaginians have a dispute with the Romans in Sicily. That's the first place that the Romans went to outside of Italy. The Romans eventually get Sicily. They eventually expand outside of that. And one of the places, of course, they eventually get is Carthage in 146 BC. The Romans also then are induced to expand eastward over to Macedonia and Greece, because both of those territories allied with the Carthaginians, unfortunately, and after the Carthaginians were defeated, the Romans expanded in that direction as well. And interestingly, in the same year, 146 BC, after the Romans had conquered Macedonia, they finally got down into Greece, and they conquered Greece as well. And 146 BC, both Carthage and Corinth, at that time the principal city in Greece, were defeated. I should clarify, by the way, that the Carthaginians were defeated in what's called the Second Punic War in 201 BC, and it was from there down to 146 BC that the Romans then engaged with the Macedonians and the Greeks, and then the Romans finally went back to Carthage because the Carthaginians violated the treaty that the Romans had with them, and that led to their own destruction in 146 BC. What now happened was that you all of a sudden had lots of land on the outside of Italy that was now owned publicly by the Romans, and the question was what to do with all that land. And the Romans started feeding that land over to very wealthy citizens, as well as a lot of the veterans who served in war. And it turned out that that violated a very old law on their books that they were ignoring, that limited the amount of publicly owned land that could be turned over to any private citizen. So a couple of tribunes, two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, showed up a few years later in the 130s, 120s BC, trying to challenge all that and trying to institute a number of plebeian-favored reforms. And when the Roman Senate resisted them, both of them tried to organize rebellions, and both of them got assassinated. That ended up cementing a permanent split between the Roman Senate and the general plebeian populace, and gradually, over time, the Republican government began to decay as the Roman Senate found itself increasingly unable to handle a whole series of crises that were coming about, including with the plebeians. And again, there's a lot of steps in this process that unfortunately I can't describe in detail here. What finally emerges, though, is that we end up with the growth of individual leaders who start presenting themselves as populist leaders as opposed to the optimates leaders. The populists are the ones who represent the people. The optimates are the ones who represent the aristocratic government, who conservatively want to keep the power up there with the top government. So the leaders who showed up on the scene as populists were our famous Gaius Julius Caesar, together with Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the one who became known as Pompey the Great, who, by the way, was the one who built that theater in 55 BC, the first permanent theater in Rome that we made a prior allusion to. So these two served as consul in 70 BC. And one of the main things they did was that they restored power to these tribunes, the representatives of the plebs. The tribunes had lost their power a decade before during a revolutionary overtake of the city by a conservative politician named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who had a collision with the plebeians because their representative Marius took away an important general position from Sulla. So Sulla now had a reign of terror position from 81 to 79 BC in Rome, and he was going after all of his political enemies. And in particular, he also stripped power away from the tribunes. But Pompey and Caesar restored that power to them in 70 BC, and that made them enormously powerful and popular themselves. So what ends up happening with the Republic is that the Senate ends up basically having to make deals with these really powerful, very well noted individuals. So what finally basically brings the Republic down is that power slips away from the Senate to these individual people. You have one trio, Caesar, Pompey, and another very wealthy individual named Crassus, who formed what's referred to as a triumvirate, although it wasn't a formal one politically, and they end up dividing the entire empire among them. That doesn't work out well, though, because Crassus dies in battle in 52 BC. Pompey and Caesar end up colliding themselves because Pompey ends up actually going back over to the Senate as it becomes clearer that as Caesar goes up north to Gaul, he's becoming more powerful himself. And Pompey and the Senate finally insist that when Caesar wants to return to Italy to serve as consul, try to serve as consul, he has to give up his army. Caesar won't do that, and so he crosses the Rubicon River into Italy with his army, which is illegal. And that effectively declares civil war. And that's why we hear that phrase, crossing the Rubicon, which means going into a new venture that you can't get back out of. And famously, Caesar was supposed to have said, alia iacta est, the die is cast, as soon as he did that. So that puts Caesar and Pompey, the former allies, into direct opposition with each other. Pompey himself was finally defeated in 48 BC in Pharsalus, often in Greece. Caesar now had complete control and somehow became perpetuus dictator, perpetual dictator, down to 44 BC, when he had all these grand schemes of things he was going to do, and he finally ended up being assassinated by Brutus and Cassius and others in the Senate in 44 BC. That's the famous Beware the Ides of March that you remember from the Shakespearean play. All right, so it is the year after that we see really effectively the end of the Republic. You notice that I put empire as beginning in 43 BC. The reason for that is that the following year, after 44 BC, Caesar's adopted son Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, and Caesar's chief lieutenant Mark Antony, and another noted politician named Lepidus, all team up in an actual, a real triumvirate this time, we usually refer to it as the second triumvirate to distinguish it from the first one. But in this case now, the three of them, basically with no intervention from the Senate, now formally divide power all amongst them. And with that, the Republic effectively comes to an end because there is no longer any legitimate place for the Senate. And of course, with the Senate now implicated with the murder of Caesar, which is the latest of a whole string of problems going all the way back to the Gracchi brothers, it's not surprising that the Senate has basically lost power and influence completely by this point. So although formally the Republic is considered to end in 31 BC with the dissolution of the Second Triumvirate, we really can see the empire's foundation coming into shape in 43 BC. Well, this triumvirate doesn't work out any better than the first one did. What happens here? First of all, we have a dispute between Lepidus and the other two because Octavian and Antony apparently start making schemes between them to freeze Lepidus out. And when the triumvirate is renewed 5 years later, Lepidus is not included. He responds by trying to seize power in Sicily with the help of the son of Pompey the Great named Sextus Pompeius. Once again, there is another whole series of battles, and eventually in 36 BC, Pompeius is defeated and killed, and Lepidus ends up exiled. So that brings it down to Octavian and Antony. But these two don't get along either. There was an initial difficulty with them right after Caesar's assassination because Antony thought he would be the next in line for succession, but then Octavian showed up on the scene. So they learned how to get along, basically. However, when Antony received his portion of the Second Triumvirate, he moved east, and it was in the middle of that he encountered the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Now, Antony was actually married to Octavian's sister Octavia, who was now apparently a very homely lady. He never, however, formally divorced Octavia, and yet he ended up taking up with Cleopatra and somehow married to her in some illegitimate way, and ended up with 3 sons, all named Ptolemy, who theoretically could have become contenders for the throne in Rome. So Octavian ends up turning on Antony and finally induces the Senate to declare an enemy of the people, and they give Octavian special emergency powers to pursue Antony. It's in that pursuit that finally leads to 31 BC, which is the Battle of Actium. That's referred to prominently in Virgil's epic work Aeneid. And at that point, Antony is defeated. The following year, 30 BC, after he's chased around by Octavian, he finally ends up in Egypt. And when it's clear that he's not going to escape, there he commits suicide. And when his lover Cleopatra hears about it as well, and she realizes that she too is going to fall as well. She also commits suicide, famously with a snake from probably not an asp, but probably a cobra from a basket of figs. And from that, we have the end of the Republic. We now have Octavian in complete control, and 3 years later, he receives the position of Augustus, and that finally brings us into the Roman Empire. I'm going to speak on one last video, not for too long about the empire, but just to give you some context so you can understand about the world in which Virgil and Ovid are writing. Okay, so come on back, next video.